Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Cleve Gilmore, and I have the honor of being the Dean of the Jack Joseph and Morton Mandel School of Applied Social Sciences. And it's a great pleasure to welcome you here today. I know we have a number of alumni from our MSSA, PhD, M&O program, also people who've done certificates here, and it's great to have you here. And we are recording this event, and so it'll be available on our website so that you can go back and listen to those words, pearls of wisdom that you listened to today. You'll be able to listen again. I'd like to tell you a little bit about Herman Stein, about whom this lecture is named. Herman was a great man, and he has left a legacy, a lasting legacy, not only at this university, at other universities, including the Beerwald School and Hebrew University, where he was instrumental in founding that school when it started in Paris and then moved to Israel. And his legacy is in the work that he has done all over the world. He joined this university in 1964 as dean of what was called then the School of Applied Social Sciences. And he remained an active scholar and member of this faculty until his passing in 2009. He was one of the first, perhaps the first or second distinguished university professor at this university. And in fact, it's my understanding that the title was created to honor his scholarly contributions, not only to the university, but internationally. In addition to serving as dean of the school, he was provost of the university twice. Provost during the late Vietnam War era, when there was much turmoil on this campus, and in the stories that he has related and stories I've heard from many others, it was his leadership on campus that helped this university to move through, which was a very unsettling time at many other universities. And those of us who are old enough to have been members of other universities remember what that time period was like. I was fortunate to meet Herman when he was serving in his second stint as provost of the university. And perhaps like the Vietnam War era, he came in during a period of crisis in the university. And his leadership was remarkable. I was a much younger faculty member, having my first experience in faculty governance in the faculty senate. And I learned from watching him of his great leadership capability and his wisdom. And I'm fortunate that he took me under his wing and became a mentor to me over those many years. When I moved over to the Mandel School, Herman was one of the first people to greet me. In fact, I think I went through a test at a luncheon with Herman. And we renewed our friendship, and he was a person whom I always turned to for advice and support during his remaining years. His life's work focused on providing a worldwide perspective on social welfare. And in choosing a speaker for our series, we look to an individual who embodies the same spirit as Herman Stein. And while it's not my job to introduce Professor Ann Buchanan, Terry Hockenstad will have to tell you that you will hear from a person whom Herman would love to have been in the audience to learn from you, Ann, in what you're teaching. We're also fortunate today that Naomi Stein, Herman's daughter's here. Naomi, would you?
Really have to stand
Yeah, well, just wave, yes. Okay. So she's here with us. And Herman, when we started the Stein lecture series, while Herman was still with us, and it was always a pleasure when Naomi and Herman were here together, and she's told me that she's made a commitment to her father that she will continue to be here. And she gives a report to him after every presentation, I'm sure. But it's always a pleasure having you here because you embody the same spirit of Herman, too. And of course, in the material that you've been handed, you can read much more about Dean Herman Stein and his contributions. This lecture, which was endowed in his name, is designed to bring an outstanding thinker and international advocate to the Mandel School to stimulate lively discussion, inspiring all to consider issues of community, compassion, and democracy around the globe. Today's presentation is on the history of social work, in which the Mandel School has been a key leader since we started nearly 100 years ago. In fact, we're about to start our official centennial celebration, and this is our landmark launching event. The Mandel School has been fortunate to have great leaders like Herman Stein, but we were also fortunate shortly after Herman moved into higher academic leadership that Terry Hockenstad came to campus in 1974 as the dean of the school. And I had actually met Terry some years before that when he and his wife Dorothy were the residence directors of a dormitory at the campus where I was an undergraduate. And so now we're a few years apart, but I remember distinctly this tall man with a very deep voice. The dormitory they were in charge of was a girls' dormitory at a time when there were still rules, parietals, and so forth. And I remember a very strong presence on campus keeping the rules. Well, as dean of the Mandel School for a number of years, and now as a distinguished university professor like Herman Stein, Terry is known worldwide for his leading scholarship in social work, and particularly on international issues. And it's my pleasure to bring him forward, and he will give the introduction for Professor Buchanan. Terry?
Thank you very much, Cleve. It's a great pleasure to be part of this program honoring Herman Stein. Herman Stein was my professor at Columbia University in the early 1960s. And that's quite a while ago, but I remember him very clearly. He was an excellent educator as well as a real leader in social work and social work education nationally and internationally. So this is a very important event to honor him. And we are very important. Do I need to use this? So sorry about that. Sometimes I speak too loud into a mic, but that's fine. Very pleased today to be able to introduce Dr. Ann Buchanan, who is an emeritus professor of social work and a senior research associate at Oxford University in England, one of the top universities in the world today. She also serves as a supernumerary at St. Hilda's College at Oxford, and she was previously the director of the Center for Research into Parenting and Children at Oxford University. She has a long, long CV, and I'm just going to hit some of the highlights of it, but I would be remiss if I didn't mention that she spent 10 years working as a psychiatric social worker before becoming part of the academic arena. So she does know what she speaks of. She has many, many honors, and I can't mention all of them, but I do want to mention that in 2012, the Queen honored her by making her a member of the Order of the British Empire, an MBE, which is a very significant honor in Great Britain given by the Queen. Current research interests are promoting, and current and for many years, promoting well-being in children, especially those at risk of social exclusion. She has books and papers written on this subject, and our master's students were very fortunate yesterday to hear about her current research, which emphasizes the role of grandparents in raising grandchildren. And even though that's not her subject today, afterwards some of you visiting with her may very well be interested in that subject as well. Her international presentations and consultations have ranged from China, Russia, and the various countries of the European Union. She definitely is an internationalist. And she was invited in 2010 by the Chinese Academy of Social Science to give consultation in China, because the Mandel School is very involved in China at the present time. This is obviously of particular interest to us as well. Her presentation today is particularly appropriate, as Dean Gilmore mentioned, to start off, inaugurate the 100th anniversary celebration of the Mandel School of Applied Social Sciences, which will go on into next year as well, the first graduate school of social work at a United States university. So we have much to be proud of over the history of this particular profession and at this particular university. She will bring a historical perspective from the United Kingdom that's very relevant to the United States, and in particular to Cleveland, as she presents on the topic of recurring themes in the history of social work. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Buchanan.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you understand my funny accent? Great. In 2014 and 2015, two venerable institutions involved in the development of social work have had their centenaries. In the UK, in 2014, Barnet House, where I am based, at the University of Oxford, celebrated 100 years of involvement with the profession. And in the United States today, we're thinking about your centenary, 2015. Though divided by the Atlantic, it's quite remarkable how similar our histories have been, but also there are dissimilarities. 100 years of history is a good moment to stop and think. Where have we come from and where are we going as social workers? Over the years, we struggled with many of the same questions. What is social work? Are the social problems we seek to alleviate due to personal fault or structural problems in our society? Social workers, are they streetwise grannies or skilled professionals? One of our ministers, our Conservative minister, said, what we need is an army of streetwise grannies. I would say we need maybe streetwise grannies, but trained streetwise grannies, as well as all the other ones. Is social work effective? That is one of the big questions. To date, social workers in both our countries have been responsible for picking up the pieces when we have boom and bust, recession and good times. And in our economies, left and right politics influence what social workers do. In many ways, my theme today is that social work is part of a repeating cycle. We go round and round and round. The conclusion from this analysis is that we need to demonstrate that our practice is effective. Our academics need to collect more data and ensure that their research has impact. Big issue in the UK at the moment, that we don't do research to put it on dusty shelves. We do research, we're all about change, and at the structural level we need to influence people at the structural level, that people who matter. Given the evidence-based centres in both our universities and the vast increase in research in both our institutions, this bodes well for the next 100 years. I feel very honoured to give this Herman Stein lecture. I've been reading about his life, and it makes me feel very humble. Your centenary coincides with nearly 45 years of my own involvement with the profession. First as a mothering aide to Professor Henry Kemp of battered baby fame when he came to England, and then 10 years as a practicing social worker in an inner urban area, and then as a researcher both at the University of Southampton and Oxford. Throughout my time at Oxford, I've travelled to all continents of the world, seeking to learn what there is to learn about improving the well-being of children. Children, as I believe, are all our futures, and we need to maximise their potential. In this, I'm perhaps something in common with Herman Stein, your Dean, 1964-68. Dr. Stein's work, I understand, focuses on providing a worldwide perspective on social welfare. And I feel very honoured to be sitting next to Naomi, his daughter here now. So what about our two great institutions? Barnet House was founded in 1914 in the memory of Canon Barnet. Canon Barnet was very interesting because he believed that actually structural problems in society were responsible for some of the evils and some of the problems that he saw. And Canon Barnet set up a settlement house called Toynbee Hall. And our department at Oxford is called Barnet House. So we have a direct link between the two. And the aim then was to advance the systematic study of current social and economic questions. So we've always been in research. And our logo for this 100 years is 100 years of social inquiry. Up the top, that was the cake we had last year at our party. And that's the SOA, 100 years of social inquiry. You know, you sow seed and hopefully you have research and things grow. In 1936, well after you, Barnet House was formally recognised as a place of higher education. So though we've been around since 1914, we were way behind you as a formal institution of education. And so I feel very much honoured to be here in one of the founders of UNIWEC. And of course the Mandel School, as you know, I'm very grateful to Nada, who forwarded the following history. And I said I wanted to know what were the sort of forces behind. And she told me that, of course, in 1913, Cleveland was growing rapidly, industrial powerhouse, which attracted thousands of immigrants from Eastern Europe and Eastern United States looking for jobs. And they needed to develop leaders who could help with social science and support these families. And in December the 18th, 1913, according to my research, 18 philanthropic organizations in Cleveland asked the university to establish a school of philanthropy, social service and public welfare in cooperation with public and private institutions of the city. And in the response to that, here is your wonderful Mandel School today. Your commitment to addressing social welfare needs remains today, as I understand it, true as before. But what we need to remember when we're talking about the history of social work, there's we have Winston Churchill up the top. And Winston Churchill used to talk about the old world and the new world, and we shared a common language, we shared some common history, and also, but maybe common values. So there is that in common, but of course over the years there have been differences. And as you'll see on the left we have a rather drawn out Union Jack, and on the right Stars and Stripes. And in the UK, over the last certainly 50 years, we have a more paternalistic approach, and we have the National Health Service and we have the welfare state. When it comes to social work, it's regulated from the centre. So central government regulates everything. So there's England, Wales, Scotland is a bit different, but there's very little room for local counties to have differences. And what is very curious is, despite this long history of training, social work as a profession wasn't registered until 2005, which was, quite criminal, really, because you had social workers practicing without qualifications and calling themselves social work. So we were way behind you in that. And in the UK, the majority of social workers work for the local authorities. But a particular feature of social work in the UK is the press are very vindictive. So whereas in the States, there's quite strong feelings about socialism and social welfare, you don't attack individual social workers. In the UK, if an individual social worker is involved with a child who dies, that individual social worker will be across the press. It's huge stress for social workers. And Sharon Sue Smith, Victoria Clembier, tragically died, and she was hounded and sacked. So that is a very big difference. So in the States, there's a much greater emphasis on self-reliance, a dislike of sort of socialism, much more emphasis on reliance, resilience, decentralized. Social work's more professional. You have registration. You've been registered for much longer. You had qualifications, and many social workers, I understand, work for independent organizations now, whereas most of ours all work for state organizations. So my theme in this talk is really to ask us at our 100 years, and I want to be a bit controversial, what is social work? And the central theme is to suggest that the history and development of social work has been inhibited by an identity crisis, buffeted on the winds of political left and right boom and bust. And this has led to repeating cycles. And I think when we want to think about the future, we want to think how we can perhaps have a calmer passage and be more confident. And I suspect in the States you are much more confident on your professionalism. So who am I? Now the first theme that I'm looking at, and I talked about this on the radio this morning, and I was a bit sad because it was overemphasized. So there are the themes that I'll be talking about. The first one, deserving and undeserving. The second one is individual fault or structural dysfunction, boom and bust, left and right, streetwise grannies or professionals. So those are the sort of themes and the arguments that have been going on. Deserving or undeserving. This has a long history. This is a picture of Elizabethan beggar being chased through the streets. In practice, how the poor are defined defines that social workers can do at any one time. US welfare was strongly influenced by the English poor laws, so the idea came across. In Elizabethan times, there was a distinction between deserving the poor and undeserving. And this is really something which continued. And if we move it to the beginning of social work, traditionally the beginning of social work in the UK is linked to Octavia Hill. And she founded the Charity Organisation Society. Very close behind that, you had people like Jane Addams, who founded Hull House Settlement. So very close, and Toynbee Hall was founded by Canon Barnett. But Octavia Hill, she had experienced poverty in her own life. And so she was very hard on, she didn't like the idea of indiscriminate giving. And so she trained her social workers, or her social helpers, to distinguish between those who were deserving and those who were undeserving. Now, it was quite controversial at the time because Canon Barnett at Toynbee Hall and the Webbs and many other people were aware that actually structural faults explained, problems in society explained some of the difficulties. And what was very interesting was that when they tried to recruit young men for the Boer War to fight, they found that a huge percentage of them weren't fit enough. They weren't fit enough to get killed. And suddenly, you know, and then there was Dickens, who was writing at this time too. Dickens was writing and talking about, you know, what was happening in the towns. So suddenly there was an awareness that actually there was two worlds. But when we think about deserving and undeserving, what is so frightening is that these thoughts don't go away. Mrs. Thatcher, when she came in, Mrs. Thatcher came from a very fierce sort of Methodist background, and her first action was to roll back the welfare state. I always think Mrs. Thatcher, she couldn't understand what it was to be depressed and not be able to help yourself. Mrs. Thatcher was very much get up and help yourself. So there we have, you know, lower taxes, cut back on welfare. And then in 2010, we had again, under Ian Duncan Smith, a cut back on welfare. Similarly, you in the States have had Reagan, who was a good friend of Mrs. Thatcher, cutting back. They were very close, I'm told, yes. They shared each other's ideas. She was a good-looking woman, Mrs. Thatcher. But the problem is that when you've got these roll back, cut back, the poor old social workers are left to pick up the pieces. You know, one moment you have services there, and the next minute you don't. If you have a child who's disabled, that child doesn't stop needing services just because the government has changed. And that is the problem. The second theme is the impact of right and left politics. And social workers are at the mercy, very similar to Mrs. Thatcher, of political ideologies. Left-wing governments define the poor as victims of unfair social structures. Right-wing governments focus on individual responsibility and the work imperative. And so there are the social workers in the middle, caught in the middle between these two. And there needs to be an awareness of the grave injustice. This is an interesting thing here. When we see how change comes about, we see that actually there's been a process over the history which has brought about change. So early on, people weren't aware of the differences between the haves and the have-nots. And so the first thing we need to do is have awareness, a social awareness, help society have a social awareness of the problems. And then there needs to be hard evidence. So you need to have then hard evidence to demonstrate of the problems. And then third, the formers need to speak the language of those in power to influence change. So when you're talking to a left-wing government, you talk about injustices. When you're talking to a right-wing government, you talk about economic factors, and you know how not helping young children, failing to invest in children is going to be very expensive in the long run. You need to be quite cynical about changing your language. With right-wing governments, you need to talk about economic benefit, as I said there. And finally, ideally, you need to have legislation. As you've been struggling through here to get the health legislation, you know, I've been reading the newspapers about Ohio and the big differences, I think 24 years or something, between the poor and the rich in life expectancy. And so, you know, your long, tortured process of getting universal health care, you've been working hard on that, and to be congratulated for doing that against a very difficult scenario. So here we learn of the importance of informing. And if we go back in history again, Disraeli who was an English Prime Minister, a fascinating man, because he was Jewish and one of the first Jewish Prime Ministers. And he wrote, there were two nations between there was no intercourse or sympathy, who were ignorant of each other's habits, thoughts and feelings, if they were dwellers of different zones or inhabitants of different planets, the poor and the rich. In Cleveland, you had 18 philanthropic organizations who brought together the information which persuaded the university to set up your school. And of course, it was the first university to have a social work course. And the UK had been a long way behind you. So in demonstrating, it's very important that academics, social work academics, and also social workers help collect the evidence. And when we got change, we had three great periods of change in the UK. First was at the turn of the century and up to the end of the First World War. And then we had a dead period. A lot of people who were killed and nothing happened. And then it was the Second World War. We had again a lot of change. And then we had the Blair, which is the next great reforming government. But all these developments were informed by data. Data for information. And so early on, you see the Booth's study, famous Booth's study of poverty in the poor of London, and then there's Roundtree's study. And then there was the Royal Commission on the Poor Laws. This is all at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th. And this brought right and left together. And it brought a whole realm of legislation which came from that. The first sort of social legislation came, but that came as a result of informing and data. So we now come to the third cycle, which is poor social workers are tucked in the middle of, and that's boom and bust. And so what social workers can do at any one time is linked to the country's economic situation. In boom times, social work has been experimental. We had a lot of fun under Blair. Experimental, preventive, community-orientated. In bust time, social work is cut back to just supporting the extremely needy. In the 1928, the global economic recession, you can see 2.5 million unemployed, welfare agencies unable to cope, limited welfare response, means tested. Most social workers, whether qualified or not, worked for very little pay. And there was a rolling back later with Mrs. Thatcher under the welfare state. Boom and bust. So bust times in the States were slightly different. The great epiphany moment, I think, in the States, and correct me if I'm wrong, because this is from my research, because I wasn't here, of course, was the Great Depression. And I think what happened there was that people could see that people were needy. Information was there. These were well-meaning, good, honest citizens who actually were in trouble, who couldn't get jobs. And there's a lot of pictures there. The public viewed poverty as a result of economic circumstances rather than personal failure. And the suffering was very public. And out of that, you had, as I understand, Roosevelt's New Deal and the Social Security Act of 1935, which is sort of the beginning. Now, my research on the States is all research, so I wasn't alive and wasn't there, so correct me. Boom times in the UK. This chap here, I don't know if you recognise him, but he was somebody called Beveridge. And Beveridge was actually a right-wing civil servant. But Beveridge, after the war, there was a big feeling that we're going to have a new world. This was the Second World War. We'd had two ghastly world wars. London had been bombed. There'd been a lot of hardship. And there was going to be a new world. And Beveridge was going to tackle the coming of the welfare state. And there was the idea of universalism. People had a right to have a job. People had a right to have a home. People had a right to have education. People had a right to have free health care. And again, 10 years later, the Conservative government, New Labour under New Labour under Blair held another boom time. So this was a massive boom time under Labour, which I had to evaluate 159 policies for children under 13 who were at risk of social exclusion. And this was they'd undertaken in 10 years. And certainly they made a lot of, they improved child poverty, they improved a great many advances, which of course tragically the recession all went back again. But they made a lot of improvement. But tragically it went back. And sadly too, we had to be honest that an awful lot of money was wasted on sort of useless projects because they hadn't researched them before. Democracy is always in a hurry. Democracy wants to have instant results. And so they had these programs which they weren't sure if going to be any use or going to work, and they put them on. And so a lot of money was wasted, and potentially some of these programs may have done harm. So here you have similar developments in the USA. You have Clinton, Blair, and Bush. There may have been hopes for welfare-friendly response under Clinton, but I understand it wasn't so friendly because you moved from AFDC to TANF. And just as in the UK, you had managed care. And again, when you had Bush, you had little support for social welfare, and Medicare was in trouble. And then, of course, you might have had hope when Barrack came. Wonderful, we all had hope when wonderful Barrack came. But he's had a lot of problems in getting his policies through with his policy. Now, another important cycle that goes round is how professional are social workers? Do they need to be trained? Are they doing what they're doing is just common sense? Now, if you go back to the early reformers, Octavia Hill felt they certainly did need to be trained. And there's Canon Barnish and his wife, who founded our institution. And they were very keen that social workers had some training. And in 1006, they set up the University of Birmingham, was one of the first university courses for social work. And I got this out of their website, and I don't want to persuade you to read it, but it gives you the cost of all the courses. So you could study British Constitution for £1, 1 shilling. That was a guinea. You could study industrial history for 10 and 6. That's about 50. That's about half a dollar. You could study industrial relations, again, for 10 shillings. And law for social workers you could get for 25 pence, you know, a dime. But they were trying, and the students had to pay for these courses to get their qualification. We then had, there was this huge development from the end of the 19th century and around the First World War. And then what happened to all the reformers? They seem to have died from between 1920 until the Second World War. There was very little movement in the UK. And where have all the great reformers gone? A lot of people were complaining. And of course, tragically, a lot of them have been killed in the First World War, the huge death toll in the First World War. But this was a lovely lady who I knew just at the end of her life. And this was Eileen Young Husband. And she took it under her head in 1947. We got to train these social workers properly. And so she had a whole lot of reports, and this is some of her result. There should be more trained social workers, they should be salaried, they should be properly paid, there should be more research, there should be graduate schools of social worker, and universities to raise standards. Now, you were doing that in the States. You were doing that, but we'd gone to sleep. All we had was psychoanalytical training for the psychiatric social workers, which was very much psychosocial. It was very much psychoanalytical. But I've always said, when you're hungry, it doesn't really help wondering about your psyche. You know, if you want food tomorrow or tonight, you know, I want money to buy food. I'm not worried about my psyche. But when I first started training, you know, Florence Horace and psychosocial social work was all the vogue. And I remember thinking, this doesn't add up. The people I'm seeing, you know, they need practical help. But again, in the 60s, there'd been a lot of scandals in the UK, and a lot of kids had died, and there'd been child abuse tragedies. And there was a big questioning about social work. And there was also concern about radical social work. You know, give me a student undertaking a 3-year social work degree consisting of the most unadulterated Marxist rubbish, and I will give you a social worker who puts their warped ideology ahead of the interest whom they're served to pay. So this was a reaction against the very radical social work. And then we had the pin-down inquiry, where a lot of children were supposed to be shut in rooms when they misbehaved, but effectively they were taken, their clothes were taken off. It was more cruel than whatever they could ever have at home. And then we had this wonderful Virginia Bottomley. Virginia Bottomley, surprisingly, sister was a social worker, and Virginia Bottomley was responsible for social workers. And she said, what we need is an army of streetwise grannies, none of this socialist nonsense, streetwise grannies. But she lost out, because training, maybe because we were looking to the States, what you were achieving here, but training won out, and there was a whole draft of training, eventually leading into 2005 to the only those who'd undertaken the proper training could call them social workers. But in the States, as I mentioned, you were really far ahead of us. The curriculum, along with individual approaches, social workers also learned how to analyse social problems, which was, you know, very interesting. A frame of social legislation, how to work in community groups, how to conduct social research, and how to establish community services. This is from Charity to Social Work, Mary Richmond, very advanced, very advanced. And by the 1960s, social work from across the pond seemed to be in a very secure state. You had changes in public health and community action, civil rights movements, wonderful. Selma, I saw the film Selma just before I came over, which is very moving. But my colleague, Barbara Hudson, she trained in Chicago at this period. And I asked her to give me her memories of her training. And she said, hugely exciting period and very stimulating. Everything was happening. And they had a very rigorous social work training. She was a behaviourist, so they had not only psychoanalysis, they had behaviourism. And curriculum centred around casework, group work. But her main memory was that when she went out on placement, she had to tie her hair back. She had to wear a skirt and high-heeled shoes. I suppose what they were trying to say, you've got to look like a professional. But, you know, Barbara was quite a rebel, and I can imagine her finding this quite difficult. Yeah. And she never ever wore high-heeled shoes, as long as I remember, at Oxford. She retired recently, she's a lovely lady. So where do we go now? Can social work survive the boom and bust, the right and left-wing governments, public attitudes to welfare, the concept of people as deserving and undeserving, and the reluctance to accept that much disadvantage is related to structural dysfunction? In varying degrees in both our countries, most people want to safeguard the poor and needy, and that is the sort of core of our basic values. We want to safeguard. But whereas they're not too worried about kids being neglected, they don't want kids to die or be killed. And it's something like they're not bothered about neglect, which can be just as damaging. So let's remember our history. And way back in 1915 gave a lecture. This is Dr. Abraham Flexner, and he gave a lecture in Baltimore at the National Conference on Charities, correction entitled, "Is Social Work a Profession?" He asserted that the field lacked specificity, technical skills, specialized knowledge, and couldn't be considered a profession. And in both our countries, there's been this continuing questioning. You know, in 1975, Joel Fisher wrote, is social work, is casework effective? And I remember in England we had Brewer and Late, can social work survive? And a lot of people, and myself, I've just a new social work, I felt quite threatened by this. But the issues of effectiveness are actually key, perhaps, to our future. And I don't think we've got it right yet. I've often argued that social worker intervenes in someone's life. There are three options. You know, if I give you this pill, this can make you better, it can do no harm, or actually it can make you worse. And sometimes we don't think about some of the things we do of doing harm. And so very much in our school in Oxford, we would make a big issue about being sure you're not doing harm. Ethically, we should be more certain that we're not making things worse. So what I'm asking at the centenary, can social workers do more to demonstrate and prove the effectiveness of their work? And we've had some very interesting discussions here with your masters and doctoral students. And I think the fault is not just social workers get blamed for not using evidence-based interventions or practice. But actually, as an academic, we should be blamed too, because we haven't made the knowledge we have useful to those in the front line. When you're dealing with day-to-day, with one-to-one cases, you haven't got time for huge research study or setting up groups. And I think academics have got a lot to do to make evidence-based useful. I've set up a website in the UK for childcare workers. You know, how old is the child you're worried about? What are the worries? Drugs, mental health, suicide. What should you do first? And then what sort of interventions are likely to be helpful? And we have a huge number of people looking at the site. And it's very quick and it's very easy. And I hope it answers the questions that social workers want. They don't have to go and look up a research study. It just gives them an answer quickly. So my questions at the centenary: can we help social workers do more to demonstrate and prove their effectiveness for their work? And I think they need the help of academics. Can social workers, academics, do more to ensure that students of social work and practitioners make use of the evidence-based information is available or makes it useful to them? And then can social work academics ensure this is thinking about not only the individual work that we do, but actually change, structural change. So I think social work academics need to collect data, social policy, and impact, develop a relationship with those in power. This is something that I've done quite a lot of recently. Impact is a big issue in the UK. And what we do, when we do research, we make relationships from the very start of the research. What do you want to know from a local authority to a government minister? And then you put that question in your research. And then when you find it, you say, well, what do you think this means to you? And sometimes I get a local authority to write the last chapter of my research report, what they think they should do as a result of the findings. So it needs to be a collaborative, much more collaborative process. So I think we're doing a lot of this. We need to give ourselves a pat on the back. we need to say, aren't we wonderful? I just forgive a little boast. In my department at Oxford, we were the top department in the whole of the UK for research. And 79% of our research was world leading, and our research had 100% impact. This is under the new assessment, framework for assessment. And we had some wonderful people. We had Lucy Kluver, who was working with AIDS orphans in South Africa, making a difference to their lives. We had another one working in poverty across 5 countries, showing that actually it's the stigma of poverty. It's no good just adding up statistics. You've got to get the qualitative information, what it means to people's lives. And World Bank has taken this and used it. And we have a Centre for Evidence-Based. And here at the Mandel School, you're not the Mandel School, sorry, I've got the name wrong, the Mandel School, we've got 270% increase in research. So that's a lot of research, and you have evidence-based centres. But of course we have nothing. We have absolutely nothing unless we have all these wonderful people who go in and day out and practice in the field. And it's been a huge privilege to me as a teacher of social work to see these wonderful people who they could go and earn a fortune. To get into our degree before, when we ran it, they had to have a first-class degree, and they could go and earn a fortune as a banker or insurance or whatever. And what they did, they chose to work with the most difficult and the most demanding profession in the world. And so I feel hugely humble when I meet my students, because they're very special people. And you too, I'm sure, working in the field, are all very special people. And we need to remember, because the job is difficult, and not many people give you a pat on the back. And who would believe it? You may not know who but this is our Prime Minister. And he's a very right-wing, he's Conservative government. And what he called social work, he called it, it's a noble profession. And of course, why he knew was he had a very severely disabled child, and so he was very dependent on social workers. When he was newly married, he was very dependent on social workers. So even though he's a right-wing government, we got the message through to him. The social work's a noble profession. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for a wonderful presentation, Professor Buchanan. Now we have opportunities for questions, and I see that Tracy has a microphone, because we would like your question to be heard by our video recording as well. So please raise your hand and we'll get the Larry.
Hi. At the beginning of your slides, you talked about the COS and Toynbee Hall, and as well as comparing that with the COS in this country, along with the settlement house movement here. And the COS, I was struck by the fact that the COS, the scientific charities, preceded them in this country by a couple of decades. I didn't realize that. But the COS in this country and the settlement had, as you know, it had great impact in terms of how it's 2 different strains in terms of how social work evolved in this country. Did the same thing happen in Great Britain?
Yes. Well, certainly the COS and the settlements were very different, because the COS was founded by Octavia Hill, and Octavia Hill was very rigid on deserving and undeserving. And whereas the settlements under Canon Barnett, they had a much broader view on the structural problems in society which caused the problems. And Canon Barnett and the Webbs went on to the Royal Commission on the Poor Laws. But Octavia Hill wasn't there. She didn't believe in that. So I think in your society, they're probably a little bit closer together, the COS and settlement. I'm not sure. What would you think?
I think they were very different. One was finally made completely matriarchal, and the one in terms of the COS, you know, these upper middle class women coming in and being able to determine what how people should be behaving, whereas it was in the settlement house movement, it was much more working together, dealing with social issues. And you had.
Well, you're absolutely right. You see, in the UK it was just the same. So Octavia Hill was very influential in Queen Victoria's relations and friends, and so it was very much these grand ladies going in, telling how people should behave. But actually, the settlements were working in the community, and they were much more related to the problems in the community. And certainly there were the two movements. Which there was in the Royal Commission on Poor Laws, there was a minority statement, but actually the majority won through, and that led to the whole raft of legislation which happened after the First World War. Thank you for raising that. Interesting. I was never quite, always a little bit uncertain about American history.
I'm sorry I didn't hear your lecture 2 days ago, because yesterday I had an appointment at Senator Portman's office. And unfortunately, I did not emphasize the economic value of all of things like Social Security and Medicare. I talked about the human issues instead of the economic issues. Yeah. You opened my eyes, and I am deeply grateful for those of us who do advocacy work all the time. Your point is so important.
Well, you need to talk. And I remember I was talking in Minnesota, and I won't give you his name, but he's a Federal Reserve banker. And he said, "Professor Buchanan, I need to see you for breakfast. And I think we need to invest in early years education, not in all these start-up companies, early years education." Because Heckman, of course, who was, I think, at Harvard, has shown that there's, you know, a much greater return from early years education, financial return, than from start-up companies. And I said, "Art, you're absolutely right. But I wonder," I'm rather naughty, "I wonder whether health comes into it." But, yeah. I'm a bit naughty, I'm afraid. Yeah.
Dr. Buchanan, it's really honor to hear your speech. So I'm an MSAS graduate, so thanks for offering this great opportunities for me to listen the history. So my question to you is like, yes, social work is a noble profession. So I'm curious, like, how the pay is in UK, because for the US, as a social worker, I feel like you can't advocate for other people because you also underpaid.
One thing is sure, is the salary isn't a noble salary. Yeah. You know, of course, you know, I think they certainly do get paid better than they used to. And you can rise up the ranks. But one of the dilemmas in the UK is that the really experienced senior professionals on the front line don't get really paid what they're worth. And they have to go into management to get increased salary. And of course, this is a big dilemma in the UK because the really experienced people go into management because they get more money. But certainly, you're never going to become a millionaire as a social worker. But it is a noble profession, but not a noble salary.
I mean, the people will say you serve poor people, what do you think? But it's come back to you, it's deserved or under-deserved. So like they say, if you serve poor people, you just get paid less, and that's it. Why is that, you know? So people have that perception.
I haven't quite heard your question, but what is interesting in the UK is there are some. So if you're training to be a social worker and you have to pay university fees, you don't have to pay back any of your student loan until you're earning a certain sum of money. And so that gives people a chance, you know, a little gap. And they don't pay interest on the delay in paying back. But of course, once they get up into management, they'll still have to start paying back. Yeah. It's not easy.
I'm going to insert a comment here. I was struck by your contrast between the deserving and the undeserving, and certainly we see that in our country in attitudes. We've been traveling to the Netherlands for a number of years now to look at how they deal with social policies, and I don't see that attitude within the Netherlands. And the way it comes out is when we look at when they describe individuals who are being served, people who are long-term drug users, people who are homeless, they say that these are not bad people. They're people who made bad choices.
Yes.
Well, that's a very different attitude.
Yes.
And it may also be one reason why in the Netherlands they tell me they have the largest number of social workers, trained social workers, per capita.
Yeah, they do.
So they're making an investment in their society.
And of course, it is an investment. You know, certainly in children. I was talking to Terry earlier, we were looking at how people are having less babies, the fewer children. And there will come a time when we can't afford to let children go on the rubbish heap. We've actually got to work with families to actually maximise every kid's potential. And so if we're talking economics, these kids are our economic future. You know, that's what you say when you're talking to politicians, right-wing politicians. And it's true, they are economic. And you can prove that kids with problems, there's a study in the UK that a kid with a major behaviour problem would cost £70,000. So translate that into dollars, that'll be $100,000. Compared to 7,000. So you can make a quite strong economic argument that these kids need to be invested in. And we wrote a book last year, and that was one of the themes, that you need to invest in children, particularly when the population, the number of children being born, may go down. Yeah.
There is.
Here comes the microphone.
There is a beginning movement here to get capitalists to invest in social services if they see that there's a financial return for them. Is that happening in England?
Yeah.
Oh, how disgusting.
Well, it is disgusting. And there's an idea that, we're supposed to have 120,000 problem families, however you define them, multi-problem families. And so they've got the whole investment, they've got people working with these multi-problem families, and they get paid on the results. Well, okay, if you do improve somebody who's got a lot of problems, if you do improve their life, good on them, But these people need help, whether they get paid or not.
And it should be reinvested back into the program.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm glad you mentioned that, the Pay for Success. That movement is definitely up and coming here. But I think its history is in another tension, and I like the fact that you pulled out themes. I have the pleasure of collaborating and learning from Dr. Hockenstadt, and I also teach the social welfare policy course here at the Mandel School. And the fact that you pulled out your themes reminds me of the tensions that I introduce my class to, tensions throughout history. Yes. Worthy versus unworthy poor is one of them. Yes. But another tension that I highlight is the role of government versus the role of the private sector. And
that's particularly important in the US.
And so that tension has always, especially in 1935 with the Social Security Act, and how Roosevelt responded to the Great Depression versus Hoover's initial response, how that tension played out. And I think it quite logically now leads to then the role of the business sector, right?
Yes.
That third leg of that stool. And so maybe there is a place for that. But if you could speak upon the role of government versus private sector in the UK.
Well, we have much less in the UK because most social services is run by government, centralised down. We have national charities, NSPCC, Save the Children, whatever. And what happened just before Blair was a quasi-market was developed, so that the local authority would say, well, look, we're going to have, say, X number of kids with abuse problems, therefore we will pay you, NSPCC, so much money to support these kids. And if you do a good job, we'll continue paying you. So this was the quasi-market which developed. It has had a lot of problems, but again, this is the sort of money for return, yeah.
Not quite privatization, but a step towards
a step
that.
towards,
Yes.
that's right.
Yes.
So it hasn't been quite privatised. But there is a move in the UK, or a lot in criminal justice, to get some of the secure units privatised. And, you know, certainly under the Conservative government, they like the idea of privatising things. I think they'd have trouble privatising social work. Yeah.
I have one other question. Can I?
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I was also struck by a theme in your presentation, which is really interesting, especially here with the Prime Minister. And it seems as though, irrespective of one's political views, your early exposure to either poverty or hardship, your earlier experiences, shapes your view of the profession more than your political ideology. And that's really interesting when you think then of our advocacy efforts as social workers and who we elect. And perhaps we elect people who've really had some kind of hardship in their life, because then they understand and they may be more sensitive to the plight of the poor and the plight of, you know, the unfortunate, as opposed to those who've never ever experienced that.
Right. Well, I'm a pragmatist. You know, I'm a pragmatist. What I care about is kids and families and those on the edge of society. And, well, if I have a right-wing government, I have to learn to work with them and speak the language of the right-wing government. And if I got a left-wing government, I work with them. But I'm totally pragmatic about it. You know, I may have my vote, which is private. But what I need to do is to work with whoever has the power. And, you know, we had somebody, I was talking earlier about somebody called Willits, who was a minister of science and technology. And, you know, I got an email from him saying, Professor Buchanan, can you tell me what's more important for kids? Divorce, poverty, social poor communities, or multi-problems? 4 paragraphs, please. And, but actually it happened, I had a sample of kids from all over the UK, and I could do some regression analysis, and I could demonstrate that actually, of course, which I knew from the very start, that multi-problem families were going to be, you know, worse for kids than any of the others. But, you know, at least they ask now. And, you know, the ESRC, which is our research council, is setting up what work centres, so that politicians, they don't want a research study that takes 4 years to do. They want an answer now. Democracy is quick. And so we now have these centres where you have a lot of expert opinion brought together, and they can give a nearly instant answer. But you have to be trustworthy. You know, you have to try and be even-handed about it. But it's very good that actually that we've, you know, have we trained them or have they got the message themselves that actually they can have more effective policies if they make use of research. And I think that's the way I think, you know, we can have wonderful radical sit-down strikes and things, but actually making relationships with people in power and working together with them brings about change rather better.
And I've appreciated your historical presentation and showing that in 1908 in Birmingham, statistics was a fundamental part of the curriculum.
That's right, that's right.
We still explain to students why they need to take courses in statistics and program evaluation. But if you're going to have an evidence-based practice, you have to know how to use these tools.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. Another aspect of your presentation, you mentioned Abraham Flexner.
Yeah.
He's very important to us because when in 1915 he said that social work was not yet a profession, that meant that people who had MSWs, Masters of Social Work, did not have professional degrees. Ours is a Master of Science in Social Administration. And my reading is we wanted to set ourselves apart from those other programs that were not professional.
Right.
And to start
Yes.
the science of social welfare.
Yeah, and certainly we've always been an MSc. We've changed over the years, but our degree is all graduate and it's all MSc.
Master of Science.
Art of Science, yeah. Hi.
Thank you, and again, good evening. I'm an alum of MSAS. I also currently work in the realm of public child welfare,
Right.
and it is tough work. We
It's
don't
tough.
make a lot of money, even in administration as an administrator, but it's a very rewarding work. And most recently, a few months ago, I actually hired a young lady from London, and we've shared some of the stories about the differences in the work that she did there versus what she's doing here in Cuyahoga County. But also, too, we pay a little bit more. She did do an analysis of that, too, for an entry-level position, entry-level frontline work. And it's just very exciting to hear your work that you've done. And also, too, I also do some things with, working at the state level as well, too. My job is really divided between both here in Cuyahoga County and in Columbus, advocating, working with the organizations that lobby to get more resources in child welfare. So it's very delightful to hear your presentation today.
Yes.
And then just another note, I have to digress a little bit.
But what I'm saying
yes.
is, lobbying is one thing.
Yes.
What you need is evidence.
Yes.
And it used to irritate me. I used to go to Cabinet Office, which is our government meetings, and we'd have lobbyists there and we'd have researchers there. And until recently, the lobbyists would have an equal voice. But the lobbyists, they were there promoting their agenda. But actually now, they don't mix us, which is interesting, because we hope to come from, serious information. And where the lobbyists are, of course, always pushing their agenda. Yeah.
Thank you. And one more piece just about Dr. Stein. I used to work at Case Western in the early 90s when I was an MSAS student. I actually became an MSAS student because of Dr. Stein. He was working in the old party hall. I was assistant director of the Upper Bound program at the time. And he said to me, I've watched you, and my office was right next to his. He said, you need to go over to MSAS, and this is who you need to talk to. And I did, and the rest was history. And I also have a couple of books that he gave me out of his office as well, too. So it's just really near and dear to my heart, being a first-generation student, coming to an institution such as MSAS, and just having him to mentor me was really quite an honor.
Well, you must be a great lady.
I can't think of a better way to end this presentation than by honoring Dr. Stein in the way you just have. Well, thank you so much. And thank you, Professor Buchanan, for a very stimulating and helpful presentation. And to hear that Belle Lykover has learned from you, and she's going to be even more effective in her presentation, is quite remarkable, because she has many decades being very effective in doing her work. Thank you so much.